You've probably absorbed two completely different pictures of what ancient humans were actually like, and never noticed they quietly contradict each other. One says early humans lived in peaceful harmony, cooperating gently, sharing everything. Warfare, a modern invention that only showed up once civilization gave people something worth fighting over: property, borders, kings. The other says the opposite entirely. Brutal, constantly violent, a species barely holding itself together, clubbing each other over scraps of meat. And civilization was the thing that finally tamed us out of it. Both pictures get repeated constantly, in documentaries, in casual conversation, in the kind of confident online argument that never bothers to check its own sources. They can't both be right. So which one actually is? Start with the hardest evidence anyone has ever found. Around 10,000 years ago, on the shore of a shallow lagoon near what's now Lake Turkana in Kenya, a group of people died together violently in a way that left almost no room for alternative explanation. In 2012, researchers led by the paleoanthropologist Marta Mirazón Lahr uncovered the remains at a site called Nataruk. 27 individuals, including at least 8 women and 6 children. The injuries weren't ambiguous. Skulls caved in by blunt force, bodies pierced clean through by sharpened stone points, some of which were still lodged inside the bone when researchers found them. Several sets of hands showed signs of having been bound before death. One woman, far along in pregnancy, appears to have been left tied and drowned at the water's edge. Lahr and her team called it exactly what it looked like. Not an accident, not a single isolated killing, but organized, deliberate group violence inflicted by one group of people onto another. It stands today as the oldest solid physical evidence of something close to warfare in the human record. Nataruk alone answers part of the question immediately. Ancient humans were absolutely capable of this. Not occasionally, not by accident, but in a coordinated, purposeful way that required real planning to carry out. Someone had to make the arrowheads. Someone had to decide as a group to travel to that lagoon and use them. Whatever romantic image exists of universally gentle, conflict-free foragers sharing everything under a fig tree, Nataruk puts a hard physical limit on how far that image can be pushed. The bones don't negotiate. But one horrifying sight from one place in one moment in time doesn't tell you what was normal. It tells you what was possible. And that gap between what's possible and what's typical is exactly where the argument about ancient violence actually lives. The psychologist Steven Pinker took evidence like Nataruk and built it into a much bigger claim. In his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Pinker compiled data from dozens of prehistoric and non-state societies and calculated an average, arguing that roughly 15% of all deaths in these populations came from violence, warfare included. 15%. Compare that to modern nations, even accounting for the 20th century's world wars, and the rate of violent death is a tiny fraction of that. Pinker's conclusion followed naturally from the number. Civilization, government, courts, police, all the structures modern humans usually resent, didn't create violence. They suppressed a rate of killing that was already staggeringly high to begin with. That 15% figure spread everywhere, repeated in talks, articles, and documentaries, treated less like an estimate and more like settled fact, the kind of number people cite from memory without ever asking where it actually came from. Then other researchers finally went back and did the tedious, unglamorous work of actually checking Pinker's sources, one site at a time. The anthropologist R. Brian Ferguson led that scrutiny, and what he found wasn't reassuring for the 15% number. Pinker's sample of prehistoric sites, Ferguson argued, wasn't remotely representative of prehistoric life as a whole. It leaned heavily on a small handful of unusually violent locations, cherry-picked cases with exceptionally high casualty counts, while ordinary sites showing little or no violence at all were quietly left out of the average or undercounted. Ferguson found real, specific problems in case after case as he worked back through the list. Sites where the population estimate used to calculate a percentage was built on shaky, outdated assumptions. Time periods stretched thin, so a single unusually violent event got counted as if it represented an entire era of continuous warfare rather than one bad stretch. At least one of the sites on Pinker's own list, by Ferguson's count, showed no evidence of killing at all once you actually looked closely at the remains. Piece by piece, stripped of its weakest examples, the picture changed. Ferguson concluded that Pinker's headline number wasn't measuring prehistoric humanity in general. It was measuring prehistoric humanity's worst possible days, quietly extrapolated outward as if they were simply what every ordinary Tuesday looked like. The scientific literature backed that correction up further. A later analysis published in the journal Nature, working from a broader and more carefully controlled data set, put the real average rate of interpersonal violence in prehistoric societies closer to 2%. Not 15. 2. Still real, still higher in most comparisons than a modern industrialized nation living at peace, but nowhere close to the vision of humanity's default state being open, constant slaughter, and nowhere close to justifying the idea that some later invention single-handedly rescued the species from itself. There's one more piece of evidence worth putting alongside all of this, and it doesn't even come from humans. Between 1974 and 1978, the primatologist Jane Goodall documented something at Gombe National Park in Tanzania that changed how researchers thought about violence in our closest living relatives. A community of chimpanzees split, and over 4 years, males from one faction systematically hunted down and killed nearly every member of the other, patrolling their old shared territory in coordinated groups, ambushing isolated individuals, using overwhelming numbers to minimize their own risk. It looked less like an animal scuffle and more like a small, brutal military campaign waged by a species that split from the human lineage millions of years before Nataruk. Whatever capacity for organized, coalition-based killing shows up in the human archaeological record, something close to it was apparently already sitting in the shared ancestor humans and chimpanzees split from. So put all of that evidence side by side, because they're not actually in conflict once you stop demanding one single verdict cover every time and place. Nataruk shows that ancient humans, when circumstances pushed them there, were fully capable of calculated, brutal, large-scale violence against other humans, women and children included, with nothing sentimental holding them back. The corrected numbers show that this wasn't the constant, grinding baseline of daily prehistoric life. Most days, in most places, for most of human history, people were not being murdered. They were gathering food, raising children, telling stories by a fire, doing all the ordinary, unremarkable things survival actually required. Both of the pictures you started with were wrong for the same reason. Each one took something true and stretched it thin enough to cover everything. Ancient humans weren't peaceful. Ancient humans weren't monstrous. They were something less tidy than either label, a species with a real, documented, ancient capacity for organized brutality that showed up under specific pressures, sitting right alongside a baseline of ordinary daily cooperation that made survival possible at all, most days, in most places, for most of the species' existence. That's a genuinely uncomfortable place to land, more uncomfortable than either simple story on its own. It would be easier to hear that violence is a modern corruption layered onto an innocent species, something that arrived with kings and property lines and could, in theory, be fully undone. It would almost be easier, in a different way, to hear that humans are simply and permanently monstrous underneath, so nothing that happens today is really a surprise. Neither of those lets you off the hook quite as easily as the truth does. The capacity for both extremes was there from the very beginning, carried by the same species, sometimes by the same people, and which one showed up always depended on circumstance, pressure, scarcity, fear, not on some fixed moral setting built into human nature at the factory. That's not a comforting answer. It's just the one the actual evidence, read carefully instead of cherry-picked, keeps landing on then and now.